Hi, everyone. Hello to our Zoom conference audience and to our YouTube audience. Thank you for being with us today. I'm Zarina Zabrisky, and we are with the Globus Books YouTube channel. Today, we will be interviewing Eugene Ostashevsky, also known as Zhenya Ostashevsky. Eugene is the author of 3 full-length poetry collections in English: Literature by Ugly Duckling Press, The Life and Opinions of D.J. Spinoza, also by Ugly Duckling Press, and The Pirate Who Does Not Know the Value of Pi by New York Review of Books. The winner of international prizes, The Pirate, described by the Italian newspaper Il Manifesto as transforming the absurdity of Russian Futurism into a postmodern poetics of immigration, was put to music by Lucia Ranchetti and staged at the 2019 Biennale, which I had the pleasure of attending, and it was a smashing success. It was absolutely fantastic. As translator, Ostashevsky specializes in the 1920s, 30s Leningrad avant-garde group OBERIU, as well as other avant-garde and contemporary experimental Russian literature. He has published OBERIU, an anthology of Russian absurdism with Northwestern Press, and Vvedensky's An Invitation for Me to Think. And that was the winner of the National Translation Award, shared with Matvei Yankelevich. And he is about to release, together with Daniel Mellis, an English language recreation of Vasily Kamensky's Tango with Cows, the first book of Russian Futurist typographic poetry. I also hear that Eugene is working on a number of other important projects, and we will have a chance to discuss it. Globus Books is an independent bookstore in San Francisco. We've been around for 50 years, almost, starting in 1971. And we offer a wide ranging stock of books in Russian and in English on all things about Russia, former Soviet Union, and under the new management, we are now expanding and doing these talk shows. So check out our schedule. We have a lot of exciting events coming. Hi, thank you for joining us today.
As usual, I'm going to start by apologizing. I tried to do this professional blue thing in the back so that I don't have a background, but somehow I wound up looking like Giovanni Bellini's lost masterpiece, Madonna in eyeglasses, as a middle-aged man. I'm really happy to be here. I'm really happy that you're doing this for Globus. And you have Goethe right behind you also. In the Жизнь замечательных людей series. I first started going to Globus, I think in 1990, and really important things happened to me in Globus. For example, I think in 91, completely by chance, I bought, it was still the artist edition, the really rare, now almost forgotten edition of Vvedensky by Melach, who was arrested between the first and the second volume of the edition. And the second volume came out in the States when Melach was already in a labor camp. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous edition. It's one of my prized possessions. And I bought it from Veronica. I've been to Globus many, 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 many times with lots of my friends. And now it's a pleasure to be there virtually from Berlin. If you hear screams, don't pay any attention to it. It's my children. I want to start with a project that is almost finished. I think I need to do one more poem for it. And it's a cycle of poems about in a very roundabout way of about the siege of Leningrad. And so it's my first time working with my history in English, which is for me extremely difficult. It's just not something that I thought I could ever do, because the history happened in in another language in another country. And the cycle is called Die Schreibblockade, which in German means writer's block, but it literally means write blockade. And I was thinking of another alternate title for it as the Feeling Sonnets, because a previous cycle, and they're going to be in the same book, is called the Feeling Sonnets. So that's feeling with a D. And it's dedicated to Polina Baskova, who is here, I think. I have returned to the city of my dead. It is the living who live there. I do not know them. The palaces have been restored and painted in pastels. The language has been enriched with new words, such as gastropub and restopub. I got lost on the way from the hotel to the poetry reading. I read poems in my acquired language, the international language of commerce, science, and now the arts. To facilitate understanding, they were projected on a screen, one line at a time. They were afforded the attention they would not have been accorded in their home country. It was near a palace where my grandmother once helped at a propaganda front to facilitate international understanding. It is now a museum of Fabergé eggs. I did not attend my grandmother's funeral because I was too far from a visa granting facility. I did not attend my aunt's funeral because I was too far from a visa granting facility. The street names have been restored to their historical forms. The park has been restored to its historical 18th century shape. Representations of me reading were posted on social media. I received many new friend requests. So as you can see, one which is written in a very kind of simple language, it starts with a quote from Mandelstam, "Я вернулся в мой город." It's a quote that's going to be repeating in the cycle. And it's a cycle where it's very important to notice two things: the things that repeat, and also shapes of words, the sounds that repeat. So like facilitate, facility, and so on and so forth. Two, in my ahistorical childhood, I translated over snowdrifts in courtyards past frozen garbage. Snowdrift is sugrob. A sugrob is no drift. It is an understudy for a coffin. Courtyard is dvor. Courtiers are dvaryane. They study fencing. They fence in the entrance. They fence nylons. They fence rations. They are brought rations and then they fence them. It is the rational thing to do. Did you say language? Gauge it. What else could I have said? I said lineage. I said garbage. I said I translated over snowdrifts in courtyards past frozen. Funny, I thought you said sausage. Back where I come from, we had no source language. Every language in my city was a target. They even had signs. Citizens during art activity do not eat swan from the side. It exceeds in edible cellulose, bad for memory. But mostly languages were fostered in the big house. The big house was where the courtiers played cricket. They were grilled mercilessly. What were they grilled for? They were grilled for hours, nights, weeks, months, not days, not days. Days are when cooks for sleeping. Crickets sing nighttime mostly. It has clock. My journey to second language acquisition took place in the courtyards behind the big house. I did not know it at the time. My source street was lacquered with many a swan. My target street was lined with tapestries or trellises. At school, we were schooled in courtliness, courtesy, curtness, and curtsies. Our chore was to choir by rote. We were the rote front. We were fostered in fronting. I died in the dark. Did you die in the dead dark? He died in a live dark. She was carded. We were carded by ropes. You were roped into death. They were operated on. It was an operation. There's an 8 in operate. 8 is a figure. A figure is a marked fig. It is singed. It is a wilderness of monkeys. A fig is. There was a fig without the gate. Who made it? Out in that dark. Made it out alive. Over ice in that dark. Taken over ice with a truck. Was taken under ice with a truck. Who was taken how in that undertaking? Who ate wallpaper? Who ate the shoes and the leather shoelaces? Who ate the leather coats of the killers? Who ate the killers? Nobody ate the killers ate. They're hard. I don't like that. I'm much happier when I write things that are not hard, but it happens very rarely. And there's a lot of play here with Russian, with names of streets. The big house is, as some of you know, is the old secret services or political police house on Liteyny. And I went to school on Voinova, on what used to be Voinova from what used to be Tchaikovsky. And there's other things having to do with blockade and memory that are all encoded in there. I don't like that. But what I do like is the way that English is estranged in the poems. And the way that words push into other words. I think one of the things that makes me, I guess, a mixed poet, a Russian-American poet, is that when I think of poetry, I think very much in terms of the sound shape of words, much less than in terms of content. And I think this is something that comes ultimately from Russian Futurism, via formalism, via concrete poetry, global concrete poetry of the 50s to 60s, who were also going from Russian Futurism and doing the same thing, which is the basic idea of it, that words that sound the same or are shaped the same have connections that are semantic. And in some ways that is the main assumption, or not the main assumption, maybe the main goal of my poems. And that's a Russian goal. That's not really an American goal at all.
think I'm going to start with my chicken and egg question with the language. So, does language determine or influence thought, in your opinion? And how does being bilingual influence your thought process and your writing process and your poetry? How does language in general reflect mentality? So, for example, when you use sugrob, and for Russians, it will be associated with grob, which is coffin, and it loses this association in English or other languages. And likewise, there are words that cannot be translated from one language to another. Do you think that this is how our mind is being formed, without going too heavy on science and determinism? What is your opinion on that?
I think this is where the difference between ordinary language, the way that we normally speak, and language in poetry, as I understand it, where the laws are very, very different. Okay? So I think in ordinary language, just everyday language, the focus is, getting your meaning across. And the vehicles don't matter very much. And the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, actually whether the hypothesis is that language determines thought or not is a matter of argument. But let's say that the strong argument version of it, which was never made by Whorf or Sapir, that language determines thought in ordinary language is false. Language points things out. Language works, calls your attention to certain things, and doesn't, a different language will call your attention to different things. Does this mean that it's going to have an effect on culture? I can give you examples where that's not the case. A very obvious example is gender in language. If you look at Turkish is completely genderless, right? They don't have gender of nouns or adjectives or blah, blah, blah. And even their pronouns are genderless, okay? Pretty much the same thing happens in Farsi, where I think the difference is formal versus informal, and human versus non-human, but I'm not even sure about that. The point is that it's not gendered, okay? Russian is super gendered. German is very gendered. Italian is gendered. English, not so gendered, although the pronouns are gendered. So if Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the strong argument, would hold, then in ordinary language, basically, I think it would imply that Turkish and Farsi are spoken in cultures that are the most gender neutral, or if you want, the most feminist cultures, and that Russian, Italian, German are the most patriarchal cultures. It's probably not the case. At the same time, I was really surprised when I read a paper that where people worked with large data, and they basically dealt with almost all languages known to man and woman, and not man and not woman. They worked with over 4,000 languages. And once you deal with statistic things like that, there does seem to be a positive correlation between a genderless language and more equity in society. But only on the level of 4,400 or whatever it is languages that they have, not on the level of any individual language. So language might call your attention to things. It might make something statistically more probable, but it doesn't determine thought. It doesn't determine thought. In poetry, it determines thought.
Right.
Right? This is really the difference between ordinary language and poetic language, right? In classical poetry, it's no doubt that it determines thought because, you know, you have meter, you have rhyme, you literally can't say, or it's much, much easier for you to say this than it is to say that. Maybe determine is too strong a word, okay? But make it much, because the formal aspect in poetry is important, because we pay attention not only to what we're saying, but how we're saying it, what words we're using. This is the point when the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis becomes true. So that's my answer to the chicken question. Now there's the egg question, which is the bilingualism. I mean, my you know, in lots of ways, my poetry is all about bilingualism or multilingualism. It's all about having more than one language. It's all about the confusion that results from going into a place where you don't entirely speak the language. So for me, I make bilingualism an issue. There are lots and lots of bilingual writers. There are lots of immigrant writers who don't make bilingualism an issue. It's much less likely in prose. At the same time, comically enough, strangely enough, in poetry, the issue is less, at least in English language poetry, the issue is much less what other languages do you know than what poetic cultures you come from. So if you are responding, this has to do with like, what is it that makes you an American poet? What makes you a Russian poet is very, very simple. You have to write in Russian. The criterion is linguistic. With American poets, that's just not the case, because you have to push yourself away from the British, from the Australian, even from the Canadian, which I personally think is just ridiculous, but yes. So you have to kind of, so it's, being an American poet is identitarian and ideological in the way that being a Russian poet is not. I mean, the criterion for American poet is just, there's so many different criteria. But one really big criterion for being an American poet is that you're responding to American poetry. For me, this is a problem because I respond to American poetry, but I also respond to lots and lots of other stuff. I respond to Russian things, to things of my childhood. And I also have formative reading experience in a couple of other languages. So in a way, what I respond to most is the way that going from one language into another, it's different. That's really what I respond to most. Going from one tradition to another, it's different. Yeah. There's something about my poetry that strikes me as very, very sad, because I'm responding, you know, in a way, when I think of poetry, I still think of things that I read when I was like 10 or 6, right? Which is, you know, Pushkin, blah, 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 rhyme, meter, da, 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 da. And then when you put this into the language of contemporary poetry, and when you put this in English, there's a tremendous deformation and crash that happens, which is very tragic. It's kind of an end of, it's an end of a tradition tragic, but that's exactly what I work with. This broke the way that one tradition and one language gets distorted in the other, the anamorphosis of it, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much. I've been reading and rereading these texts, which I find to be basically a completely new gesture. And I feel somewhat overwhelmed by what is happening here. So I guess the question that I'm very interested in how you answer it for yourself when you work this is, who is your reader? Who is your
I don't know.
intended
That's a
reader?
real problem. I have no idea. It's kind of freaking me out. And a really big issue is also that I live in Germany now. And since I've been living in Germany, I very largely fell out of American poetry because you need to network, you need to, I mean, you need to be present in a way that I just haven't been able to be. And now I'm writing all these things that have nothing to do. So I have no idea. I mean, I would like this stuff to, for example, to be published in Germany, but they will want to translate it, but pieces of it are in German. And Uljana Wolf already translated 3 of them. In fact, I think the 3 that I read, or two of the 3 that I read in another one. But it's a real problem. So,
well, I think that the crucial factor is that you, other than networking and institutions, but actually what is important that you are creating your reader. Your reader is impossible from the start of this text. Basically, nobody knows what siege was. And in the languages that participate in this action, English or German, nobody knows largely. And in Russian, mostly they don't want to know. So one of the most radical actions of what you are doing, that you are creating this reader. The reader is utopian. And I think your creation of this reader is one of the most important things that you are doing.
Well, I hope it becomes an actual creation of a reader. We'll see. Okay, I want to read the next 3 pieces, which illustrate, in a sense, what I've been saying. So the next piece, it starts with it starts with a reference to Canto 33 of the Inferno, to Ugolino. He's not, I mean, he's down in hell for something else, but the story that he tells Dante is the story that about starving to death and eating his children who died before him. Luckily, the body of Ugolino has been found about 15 years ago, and the forensic anatomists, or whatever it is that they're called, have said that his teeth were too bad. His teeth just were so terrible that he couldn't have possibly eaten his children. So we now, and there's other evidence, maybe not enough protein in the bones or something. So we now know that that's a myth, but anyway, okay. That's what the references are to Dante. Ugolino city, hast du gegessen? Schmeckt's? Wie schmeckt's, Golod Giloi? Flags are flagging in Gatchina, hammers hammering down in the Mga. You fronted, you wept not without, city of Peter. You may state, dentro impetrai, I'm all saltpeter within. Who shall manumit you from the indignity of eating, from the staining of the clothes and the chewing with a mouth open? The body swells. Another law has taken its members, whose liver shall deliver you from the body of this death. Body, boding, der Boden. Read bread, bread. This bread is red. Bread in double language is Brot, das Brot. Peter, repeater, repeat after me, poor eater. Das Brot ist zu klein. Is das Brot oder Stein? I am not Peter, no matter. For they shall deliver your bread by weight, and you shall say, the breadth of this bread is an and. Command that these stones be made bread. Sprich, dass diese Steine Brot werden. What man is there of you, whom if his child ask bread, will he give him a stone, der ihm einen Stein biete, Peter? There's a lot of stuff here from the Luther Bible, especially a lot of Paul, in addition to Dante. And dentro in Petrai is what Ugolino says, I turned all stone within, and stone is Peter. Peter eater bit a platter, bit a table, bit a bit off, bit a pit out, spat a stone, ate the door, empty emperor. You first, famine before rule, cannons sound, cannons swound. He strides, peremptory as a storm cloud. He bought artifacts, fetuses pickled in formaldehyde on impulse. And still it wasn't enough. Ate the angel, ate the steeple, ate the gentry, ate the people, ate his infant son Alexis, which means wordless. Why would you even name your son that? He forgot the name he was going to name. He ate and ate and ate until he was 9, and then he evacuated. Yet if not for his pack of papers, we would all be lisping in English now. A ruler is a thing of measurement. He induces the ferule with a ferule. Ferule is a metal ruler. And fetus is pickled in formaldehyde is, it's Kunstkamera that Peter bought. A lot of these things are recognizable to people from Leningrad. What word? Bread. What word? Bread. Bread word chlieb. But red. Chlieb. But rot. Rot mouth. Ch breath. Leb, live, imperative, cut, but, what a bread, be bread, be breadth of breadth, be dear, brand, sawdust, cut, brood, eat bread, have no dread, be not dead, eat, bread is to be, brand, sawdust, cut, bread is not to be, red, what is red is word, bread, dear, word is breath, eat word, what a beauty. And what a beauty is, it's Kurt Schwitter's when he's learning English. It's a really beautiful piece of his in English, barely learned. Yes, so there's this whole kind of linguistic mixture here.
All right, so then I will ask you my German language question, because that last one really brought it up. So as some people know, and some our viewers probably don't, many generations of Russian children or children in the Soviet Union, not necessarily of Russian ethnicity, were brought up on movies about war, where the German language was depicted in a rather horrible way. And one way or another, it created some sort of German language phobia. and creates almost a visceral reaction when you hear, because we saw German shepherds and heard Hände hoch, and then some terrible things happened. So how does your move to Berlin in Germany affect your life, your poetry, your language? What happens there?
It's a really difficult question, and it's a question that basically has, for me to answer it, has to be preceded by the question, do I want to mythologize myself or not? And I don't know. Basically, and because in a way, this is like, well, why do things happen to you? To describe, so for example, with German, I'm generally not really bad at learning languages, although I'm pretty lazy. And I've spent a huge amount of time in Germany. I mean, I've been living here since 2013, but I was here every summer before that for years. And I was even here in college for 3 months. But my German is terrible. It's just terrible. I mean, it's, I mean, I don't really speak it. I'm kind of beginning to slightly speak it now. But the question is, okay, so how do I want to explain it? I can say, okay, so this has to do with, you know, whatever, the mythology of German with Russians. But in fact, I never saw that many German war movies. I mean, Russian war movies about Germans. And in fact, I mean, okay, so I learned Italian in a very short time, but I learned French in school before that. It's a very easy jump. German is not an easy jump, even from English. It's not like a Romance language that when you know one, you can very easily go to another and learn it super fast. It takes a huge, huge effort. And I never really focused on making that effort. And also, the kind of people I meet here tend to speak English. They tend to be able to speak circles around me in English. If I try to speak in German, I mean, it just doesn't work. So basically, I can either say, okay, so it has to do with World War II, or I can say it really has to do with very basic lack of socialization here, or with, you know, not making enough of an effort, with having 2 kids, with having work to do, with not having time to learn it. So it's really kind of, it's very much on how you want to present yourself. Some more things. So on the one hand, we meaning, you know, kids who grew up in Russia in the shadow of the war, and we grew up in the shadow of the war, were taught to hate German. And I have to say, I was at a playground the other day, and there were these girls, 5-year-old girls playing, and one of them said to the other, and I just thought I would die laughing. But Russia really has a connection to Germany. Especially Leningrad or Petersburg has a connection to Germany that is, I mean, we're really part of the same cultural space. You just need to walk around and look at houses in Berlin, right? In the way streets are laid out in Berlin and the way streets are laid out in Leningrad. You know, it's really not New York. It's very much the same space. But even compared to Paris, and I spent many years, I spent whatever, 3-4 years living in Paris. I spent almost the same time living in Italy. they're not the same space. But Germany is the same space as Leningrad. So when you walk on the embankment, right, when you walk by the Winter Palace, if you look at the old street signs, they're in Russian and German. You know, the street signs that are on stones that are in the sides of the houses, they're in Russian and German. And in addition, and this for me is very, very important. So classical Russian poetry, if we start with Lomonosov, right? So syllabo-accentual, is built on German models, right? It's not built on French models because that's syllabic, but it's also not built on English models. And it's really different from English poetry. English is a is a language with lots and lots and lots of monosyllables. You can't have the same rhythms in the same metrical structure in English. You're not going to have the same rhythms as in Russian. In German, I mean, you read 19th century German poetry and it's like, you can say this line is like Pushkin, but this line is like Boratinsky. I mean, that's unimaginable in English. You can't do that, right? The way, just because, because the stress system is just, in English is very different. So there's a weird way in which German, although in some ways, as an English speaker, you recognize all these weird things about English in German, is also weirdly kind of a crypto form of Russian. I mean, in terms of its poetry. I mean, thanks to Zhukovsky, thanks to Lomonosov, blah, blah, blah. And finally, German has a very funny relationship to English, which is there's an incredible amount of words that look exactly the same and that have different meanings. And this is what my friend Uliana, who some of you know, Uliana Wolf, okay, her poetics goes way beyond that. I mean, she's a very varied and complicated poet. But one of her things spoke to me is she would write poems in German with a German word having the meaning of the English word that looks exactly the same, right? And that creates this dvig. And I learned this from Uliana, and I've been using it tremendously. I mean, there'll be poems later, and I use it so much I don't even notice it anymore, but there are certain poems that use it much more. I'll read some of those later. It's called Sowjetisches Ehrenmal Tiergarten, it's the Soviet monument that they built in 48, 49 in Tiergarten. So in the West Berlin part, in the American or the part of West Berlin, the Soviets built a monument with a big, the usual, the big bronze soldier on kind of a Stalinist colonnade with a T-34 tank here, T-34 tank here, a couple of cannons, kind of the usual. But it's still there. And it's just strange to walk around Tiergarten and you suddenly run into it. The hero is held. The hero is held over a park. The hero is held over a flame. He's held by fame. Has he a name? No. A hero is held to be a hero. By whom held? Whose hero? He, her hero. Because he has hose. What hose are those? Those are some hose. Has she no hose? No. He, her hero. Those with no hose are held. Those with hose are held. Those with no hose are held by those with hose, then no hose. Are they held here? They're held here and there. They're held handily. They're held artfully. Come up and hold my artillery. Thank you for coming, come again. So the German here is that the word held is hero in German, right? And Hose is pants, but stockings in English, and a bunch of other things. There's a few other details, but that's what the poem is basically based on.
It made me think, because my realm is in Dutch, because I go to Flanders very often, and Holland. And what I've noticed that Dutch is in a way transitional language between English and German, and became my window to understanding some German in a very weird way, because the words in English, Dutch, and German all mean different and sound the same. So it creates this warped sense of this group of language, which I find very interesting and kind of peculiar. And I also, when you were talking about German language and your relationship to it, it made me think of all the nameless, wordless that you've said, because Немецкий, Немцы, Немой, it comes from the word for non-Russian speakers, the deaf and mute, which is all without the words, and it was applied to all the foreigners in Russia. So all the area where the foreigners used to live in St. Petersburg was called Немчина. So it's like this whole connection without the language, without words, and yeah, certainly something to go into. That brings me also to the next question, and one of the last probably for that, and maybe you want to read some more poetry after that. But everything you read today and most of the things we're talking about, one way or another, goes back to the
Stop it. Stop. Sorry, one second. You're supposed to be going to sleep.
But I'm here alone.
Okay, can you sit here, but I'm talking, okay? No, come on, please. Okay, let's
all right. Well, that kind of comes along because it brings us back to the family history. That was my next question. So here comes the family transgenerational trauma maybe happening right now as we speak, as you see the blue shield moving. Maybe we are, transmitting it now, but call it what you want, trauma or not. But generations, and the generations we're talking about of the former Soviet people and children, in particular Soviet Jews, are formed by some collective experiences. And it goes way before the revolution, the Pale of Settlements, the pogroms, then revolutions, then we go into the more or less modern period of civil war and great purges, Holocaust, anti-Semitism, in your case, immigration. So if you look at it, there is no one decade in collective history that went without a crisis of some epic proportion. Alexander Atkins says in The War Grief that the first two generations don't have voice to speak about it. They don't have words. So they are silent, and there are gaps and lies and secrets. And then comes the third generation, and they start processing it and finding words and art and ways of putting it into the public space. So do you think you were influenced by the lies and silences of your ancestors, of such gaps in family history?
Once again, it's very hard. So, you grow up in a family that develops certain attitudes as the result of the war is the result of the extreme authoritarian system, the fear of the 30s, the fear of the 40s, the fear of the 50s, that you can't help but have that shape you. The question is to what extent you can get out of that. And I'm not sure that I think I know lots of people that have done a much better job of getting out of it than I think I have. I think one thing about growing up in the Soviet Union, well, okay, so this is, at least for me, like I feel in lots of ways that I'm politically defective, in that I somehow inherited the sense that you can only be free internally. So it's very hard for me to translate what I want into any kind of external political action. And in my personal mythology, I do think that this has to do with the Soviet system. I think the whole point of the Soviet system is to prevent people from participating, giving them this myth that they can be free inside, to control the public sphere. And somehow I haven't been able to break that, to get out of the public sphere. But if you look at Belarus, that's what's going on there now. People are breaking it, right? And some people, have become extremely good at actually being politically involved, at breaking with that. So it doesn't, you do have this inheritance, but there are ways of getting out of it. I guess another problem with this, and this is the immigration problem, the way that myself was constructed as having to do with the Soviet Union makes sense in Germany. Like in Germany, there are people who understand that, right? Because they had the experience with GDR. In the States, I mean, apart from France, apart from Slavists, this is something that doesn't exist at all, right? And this is not just for me. The big problem with immigration is that, one of the big problems is that you come with your history, but nobody considers your history to be history. It doesn't matter, right? What matters is their history. So, and this moment of, I need to abandon my history so that I can serve your history, is extremely unpleasant. I think a lot of people don't even realize that it's there. And I think it has to do with immigration in general, and it causes very bad things. By immigration in general, I mean, for example, Turks in Germany. Like, I have absolutely no reason except kind of an inner sense of why I think this is so. But I think when people move to Germany and they go to school and they're basically said, okay, so here's the Holocaust. It's your history now. And they have a very bad reaction to that because nobody wants that as history, right? Something similar happens in the States with race, right? Although, in Germany, talking about the Holocaust is much more, it's much more of a national project, and it's in the States, everything's much more chaotic. But you come in there, and at a certain point, like, you're handed race. And you're like, okay, so what do I do with it now, right? as a Turkish kid, you're handed the Holocaust. And yeah, I mean, you move to Germany, it's good for you to think about it. But there's also a sense in which people that handed you this are not really interested in thinking about what made you. And when you come to the States and you're handed race, you're supposed to take care of it, but what you come with doesn't matter, right? I'm giving just these two examples. I think this is really the same with immigrants and refugees, especially everywhere. I don't know, the Syrians who come here, even, the liberal Germans who, in general, like, it's very hard to imagine Syria for Germans, right? I don't just mean the war now, I just mean the war plus the thousands of years of history beforehand. So basically you come with that, and ultimately that's off the table. Ultimately, you don't have the right to it. You have to take on German history. I mean, at least if you're a kid. And this is a really big problem with immigration. This is something that I don't think people really talk about.
And always brings me back to my favorite piece of literature, which is the epilogue to War and Peace, the philosophical part, the so-called boring part, because that's exactly what he's talking about there. He's saying that there's no such thing basically as, at least he questions the collective history. He says that it all boils down to personal histories, to the personal histories of families, and that is something that literature can study, which transitions us. Let me make it my last question, and I put two in one. If you possibly can briefly say what is literature, or more, in particular poetry, is for you, how would you define it? Is there such a definition for you? And if so, what is your role as a poet? And from here comes, what are you working on now? What are the projects important for you now to bring into the world at this time that we should acknowledge is?
Okay, there's actually a translation thing that I want to talk about, and remind me if I forget.
I will.
But first, I want to address the first part of the question. Okay, so I think the question, what is poetry, is a very legitimate question. I think it's a question that everybody has to ask themselves who is interested in poetry. What is it that makes a language act poetry, or poetic? Is poetic the same thing as poetry? Because it's very, very different in different societies. They're really, in part, it depends on technology. There are really big differences, for example, between oral societies and literate societies. And I think we're now in the third phase, which is societies with computers. I think depending on the conditions, the markers and conventions will be very different. So for example, in oral societies, poetry is not fixed text, it's improvisational. And people train for many, many years, and they work with basically formulas, and they work with formulas that are late to meter, but they're constantly improvising. So there's no text, right? It's an action, and it's every time you do it differently, and it depends on who is in front of you, right? This is not just Milman Parry and Alfred Lord on Homer and Yugoslavia. It's the same thing in Morocco. It's like that everywhere. Then you have a phase where kind of writing makes headway, where print begins, and you're dealing with a fixed text, but you're dealing with a fixed text that still has all these features of orality, except that they've become fixed. So it has these formal features like meter and rhyme, or sometimes it has rhyme. Usually it has meter, or it has tonal regularity, like in classical Chinese. And we are now in a very, very funny phase, because as of late, it's been a very short while, maybe 100 years, maybe less, in some places much less. Maybe it's only been a few decades where we've lost orality. And now in the computer age, the computer is our memory, and the computer is our knowledge. So in the States, for example, especially also because of capitalism, because suddenly poetry has become monetized, and you have the whole creative writing industry with thousands and thousands of people who are paying tuition, who are getting degrees, who are teaching. You have lots and lots of poetry presses and so on. And what this has done is basically what makes something poetry is primarily pragmatic, right? Poetry is language that's written down by somebody who's recognized as a poet, by somebody who has a degree, by somebody who says she's doing poetry. It's the frame right now that makes poetry poetry. So, we publish lots of books now, which 150 years ago, even 100 years ago, nobody, not a single person would think that this is poetry, right? It's poetry now because the markers are different, the conventions are different. Now, what is poetry to me? In this sense, I'm very kind of between, I'm very much in line with my biography. It's, what I like is when I deform language. And that really has to do with Russia, with Russian avant-garde, except the language that I'm deforming is English, American English, in some ways that are really not Russian, but American English ways, or, but this idea that poetry is, I wouldn't put it, but this is the way that Jakobson puts it, violence done to language, or that it's the estrangement of language. It's a very particular tradition, right? It's not just a Russian tradition. There's stuff like that in English. But, the person in English that in the past few years has been the most important to me, Gertrude Stein, is somebody who spent basically her whole life outside the States, right? Apart from a few years in school, right? Somebody who's constantly surrounded by another language, who leads most of her life in another language, somebody who's a German Jew saying that she's American, but living mainly in France. And so over the past few years, I've been more and more thinking of what I do and like this heroes held stuff as something that really has to do with Cubism. And I've been thinking a lot about not early Cubism, but like Picasso brought Cubism, like 1911, 1912, 1913, when what they're doing with visual shapes basically cutting out perspective, calling attention to that form becomes the form of this or the form of that by context when they start applying that to language. So when Picasso starts doing collages, Braque starts doing collages with pieces of words. And you can take this word piece and you can read it this way, or you can read it that way, or you can read it that way. And here, I mean, with Braque, obviously that's not the case, but with Picasso, if you look at Picasso has a huge amount of stuff about being Spanish, right? Or rather, not about being Spanish, but about being perceived as Spanish in France, right? And I think there's a lot, and Juan Gris also, there's a lot of, even though Picasso is somebody who spent his life really in French, right? Spoke French, but there's still a lot of play with like weird French. So I've been really drawing on that. And I've been drawing on like this idea that you take a word, you put it in one context, in another context, in another context, and it becomes like Cubist planes. So that's how I've been thinking of my stuff. It doesn't always work out. Sometimes there's too much content. I would like there to be less content and more just looking at the words. At the same time, as befits a person who is fanatically opposed to translation and tries to make his poems as untranslatable as possible, I translate a lot and I edit other people's translations. There's a whole bunch of projects that are coming out now that I helped with. And for example, one of the things that's coming out is F letter, New Russian Feminist Poetry, which is, it's going to be a tiny, like a book half this size, like a tiny book, really gorgeous, with a selection done by Guernica of work by Yusupova, work by Baisakina, work by Agamalova, a few more people, really strong work that I really like a lot. Completely, unthinkably different from what I do. I mean, just entirely different. So, so Anthony and I have been kind of trying to coordinate the translations on that, and that's coming out soon. And actually, if anybody's interested in reviewing this and reviewing another book that's coming out in the same time, which is Gala Rimbu's solo book, which is coming out at Ugly Duckling.
I want to jump in and say that we are doing, Globus does launches for pretty much all of the above. I'm talking to Ainsley about doing the launch or the talk about the feminist anthology, about Yusupova's launch, and we already have scheduled Galina Rimbu's book from Ugly Duckling Press, scheduled in October. So check our schedule, it will be here.
It's the 17th, right? I mean,
yeah.
For October 17th.
Yeah.
But anyway, if anyone wants to do reviews of those two books, please let me know. We're looking for potential reviewers now. Part of the Kamensky Tango with Cows project is finally coming out, which is Russian futurist stuff that's the most like Cubism with breaking up words. So I worked on that with Daniel Mellis, and that is coming out very soon. Kamene. A swan engages in self-reflection. The gardens of Leto do not commemorate NYRB. Riven, the vernal ice drifts on the Never River. Ava, my daughter, has a fever. Her face looks thinner. She ate bread and butter, my daughter. She wants me to lie next to her so that she may grab onto the sides of my head and drift off to sleep. Fata, water. She wakes up, goes to pee-pee. I hold her over the bowl. I try to wrap her in a bathrobe. No, I'm schwitzing. I do not need it. I'm not cold, I'm wet. She sneezes, a popel hanging out of her nose. Der popel, but die Papel. Ich sah meine Papel, and so on. She reads asterisks and is delighted when I tell that Ava is Ava spelled backwards. Papa, says Ava, holding a brownish apple. Schmeiß es weg. I schmeiß it weg. We live in Berlin. This starts with the word siege in different languages. Die Siege in German is the plural of der Sieg, which means victory. In French, la siège means seat, la chair means flesh, and la flèche means arrow. Our siege means you pull up a chair and wait for the city to eat through its stores and then starve, achieving victory. The word siege also has a dead meaning in English in the context of dysentery. There would have been no deaths from starvation during this siege had food stores been distributed equally. I visited the monument to the heroic defenders of Leningrad with my aunt once on Victory Day. White poplar down was distributed equally in the air on Victory Day. Heroic defenders is a concept that reconciles the recipients of feasting rations and fasting rations into a single united front. I have returned to that front famous city, especially famous for the fronts of its buildings along the river. Now the names of its streets are restored to their historical forms, which are the forms they bore when there were stores along them, as there again are. Now the park is restored to its historical 18th century shape. The statue of Saturn cuddling his baby has been cleansed and now is whiter than ever in living memory. The statue of Apollo and Artemis seem to breathe as they wield their bows. All they're missing is a statue of NYRB. The bust allegory of the transience of life was missing with only the sign left on the pedestal, but now it is restored, and she seems entirely untouched by time's artillery. This is true. Once I was walking around in summer gardens, this was maybe 10 years ago, and there's an empty pedestal, and it says allegory of the transience of life, unknown sculptor, 18th century. So I have a picture of that hanging in my office. You have been renamed Letterborg, lately and literally, for you are a literal city, and the river rhymes around your purse. Those who part from you place their birthplace on the tip of the tongue and call it their Forgettysburg address. The deserts of your squares are speechless. The arch of your general staff is arch. Letter Forgetter, letters are for climbing, die Buchstaben sind zum Klettern. Your prospects are ladders of beach. Buchen Leitern. For literature is a beach, it is wood or woad. This wood you call book, read book, but in the mountains, Chinar, Makar, and the letter Bukva. 87 years ago, they were holding a conversation, the dead or die Toten. A conversation is to be held with care, for it breaks easily. I have broken the staff of your bread. I have broken its Buchstab, a bookstaff, and you shall eat of it with offal and cellulose. Beech has not much rot resistance and is spoken of as non-durable and open to attack from the ground with air support. Places famous for their beech wood may also be famous for arts and letters. For example, Weimar. Letter Forgetter, remember us in your Tot phenomenon, Forgettersburg, Vale. Tot phenomenon is tip of the tongue phenomenon, but Tot means dead in German. And 87 years ago is, I just finished an article on the conversations by the Chinari, and they took place exactly 87 years ago, and that's why it's Forgettersburg address. explanation. Contour. For me, it's really important that your contour, the discoverer, the inventor of set theory, is from Petersburg. He's from Vasilievsky Island. There's even now a plaque on the building. His family immigrated when he was about 10. And I have this fancy idea that one-to-one correspondence, that the idea for one-to-one correspondence comes from looking at colonnades. Repeating city, column after column. The pedestal rhymes with the base, cradle of contour. Cradle of contour, the pedestal rhymes with the base, column after column, repeating city. Repeating, arise, arise. From death arise, from risible death. You numberless infinities, where is your witticism? Arise and speak in ribbons with punchlines. Behold, I suffer death by banana. What's a banana? Death by swamp water and death by the bellowing brown river pacifies pacification. Death by fire and especially by friendly fire. Death by state security services because the state is always feeling insecurity that it's not providing enough services. Death by rationing, irrational death, when those with less food die so that those with more food may have yet more food. Death by enemy. Have you seen the enemy? No one has seen the enemy. Death by Goethe and Kant and Schiller. Death by the Erlkönig. Death by German Romanticism. A hydroptic death, death of the translators of Dante. A one-eyed death, death of the translators of Homer. Death by dearth, that is to say famine, a familiar and familial death, death of practically everybody. Death by camping. Oh, you numberless infinities, grown delicate with the satieties of night soil, pull yourselves together, Osiris. Is the granite keeping you down? Be not undone, rise up and be counted. Is the granite keeping you down? Rise up and return to the ranks, trade dejection for bijection. Take a number and also a name. Is the pomegranate keeping you down? Trezzini, Rossi, Rastrelli, Quarenghi, our Harlequin come from Bergamo, Montferrand, contour, 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 a contour in Letterbourg, the contour of Letterbourg, count, uncountable. And that's based on a Donne sonnet. From the square corners of the round earth arise, you numberless, from death, you numberless infinities, and to your scattered bodies go. And this one is based on Mandelstam, together with an American World War II song, We'll Meet Again Some Sunny Day. And the woman who sang it has just died. Shall we come together in the city? We'll meet again like lips in the syllables of its name. Have we taken something under there? Our son. Let's pronounce the sound of a word or maybe denounce a byword. It is a silly word. It is also a wound. It is tightly wound. It is unsightly. It is a word sung by the souls of women. We'll meet again is a song. It emerges from their mouth like a sword. It slices open the night. It is sung gainfully. It is sung soundly. It is heard. It is a password. It passes controls. It passes controls unhurt. We'll meet again in a song. We'll meet again some sunny day when the blue skies drive the clouds far away. We'll meet again is a song. It is a sung song. It is a sun song. You will not note the sun because we have buried the sun in sound. That we have soundly in a shroud. Is he unhurt? Is he unheard in the shroud of sound, of snow? The sound of snow. now, we have buried him now, we have buried him. The closing. I have returned to the city of my dead. It is my familiar. I command that it drown everybody. Everybody drowns in tears. These are emotional tears measuring a higher concentration of hormones such as adrenocorticotropic hormone and leucin enkephalin than basal or reflex tears. The drowned lie around and consume fish oil rich in omega-3 fatty acids. It is December. In December, everyone is a little bit of a Decembrist. They follow their star in egg tempera. They back up all their contacts to cloud. This way, if they lose contact, they just need to select the date they want to restore from and press restore. Then time will run in reverse, and all the dead shall come back for the restorer to be a child all over again with. To be a child all over again is to be learning to speak all over again. The Russian word for language is the Turkish word for pity or shame. If next time you exclaim, alas, you wish to do it in Turkish, you cry, yazık. If you address a dead person and get no reply, you can say, ni yazık, which is the same as too bad. You who pause on the stairs, jangling the lock chain, you watch the girls in the courtyard skipping the rope of Europe. Are these your daughters? They address each other in German. Your guests from the future are here. May you live to watch them grow.
I've heard you talk in the past about translingual poetry. And as I recall, there are different views of what that is. Can you explain for us how you define translingual poetry and whether the work we've been hearing today is an example of that?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about how I define it for me. For me, my work is that, and my work is that simply because it collides different languages in the space of a single poem. Actually, no, not simply because of that. The word collides is very important. They don't explain one another.
Not translation.
It's not translation. It's not like I'll have a word and then I explain what it is. They disorient each other. A shape in one language will travel to another language and influence the semantics of the, like, there'll be like quantum entanglement between two words of a different language because of their shape. That's how I think of it. I think in the States in general, I would say that my definition is very formal in that it's concerned with like what the words do on the page. Whereas in the States, in general, people think more in terms of context. So in terms of representing languages that aren't sufficiently represented. You don't necessarily, you just put it there. You don't necessarily need to involve it in the formal. The discourse mostly is political and social rather than formal. For me, that becomes slightly an issue when we start having translingual stuff in English only, which we do because work and different Englishes brought together is regarded as it. People use the term translingual for it also.
Oh, really?
For me, that's a problem because I don't want everybody in the world to be speaking English. For me, that there's something very imperialist about that, saying, okay, we have, I'm not denying that English is a global language, but I just think that we need a separate term for work that collides, Indian English with non-Indian English. But it's become kind of a blanket term.
Thanks, that's helpful.
I actually wanted to show something. This is the textbook in Esperanto from 1904. So I believe that there was the dream of this global language for a while. So another interesting subject to discuss in the future. We have a question from Daniela. So Daniela would like to ask Eugene, who are his ideal translators? The ones who get the meaning or the ones who get the sound? In the latter case, is it enough to mimic the sound? Since a lot of the wordplay operated at the lexical level, the transliteration does not seem sufficient.
I think right now, translation in the States, even with poetry, the main concern is with semantic fidelity. And I've done a lot of projects with other people, and that's pretty much all the comments you will get are fidelity comments. And I think fidelity is really important. At the same time, the problem with fidelity is that it bowls over the poetics of the original, and it doesn't, it hides, it doesn't say anything about why the words are there in the first place. The words are there in the first place because formal features of that language have brought them there. And I want a translation, not necessarily one that mimics the sound of the original, but a translation where the words have a reason to be there, apart from the fact that they're translations of words in another poem. And preferably that this reason is very similar to the reason why the words are in the first poem. So I want the translator to be constantly thinking about whether she can translate the poetics. At the same time, I also don't want people, I very much don't want people to limit themselves just to reading the translation. I think any translation is a response to the original poem. I think even if you don't speak the language, I think it's incredibly helpful to look at the original, to not have the translation be a replacement, but to have it be an answer, and you need to know the original thing that the answer is true. Does that make sense? This is a way in which I think my ideas about translation are quite extremist. I really think that to appreciate the translation fully, you need contact with the original, no matter how faint.
Yes, and большое спасибо to Zhenya and Zarina for this fascinating experience. I'm one of those people, Zhenya, who paid for an advanced degree, and I did it twice. Most recently, I picked up an MFA in creative writing, but long ago, when I was Ivan's age, I pursued a master's degree in social sciences. And that's why I was so fascinated when you were talking about Sapir and Whorf and their hypothesis, which came into my original master's thesis way back then. So I'd like you to tell us again, or in a different way, what does the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis have to do with poetry? How is it applied? And then secondly, you pass back and forth between different languages. In a sense, to my ears, it sounds like you're riffing in a jazz way, and I like that. But for all poets, what is the great value in learning another language for a poet?
Thanks. Those are really good questions. So I think the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, no one I know ever applied it to poetic language, except there's an article by Geraldo de Campos who talks about Pound's translations of Fenollosa, where he either does that or comes to the verge of it. The basic point of it is this: at least in some traditions intensively, but in all traditions to some extent, even very faint extent. In poems, the shapes of the words matter. The etymologies might matter. When I say matter, it means that this word is connected to that word. It's like it. It looks like it. Yeah. It, could be connected by rhyme, like cat and hat. Yeah. Cat and coat, right? It could be connected in a different way. Now, this kind of formal connection, formal likeness, makes words more likely to be associated together. So in English, a cat in a hat is kind of a natural construction. In Russian, kot v shlyapе, it doesn't even mean a cat wearing a hat. It's just, so this is a way in which, this is something you can think about with Sapir-Whorf, right? Here are two languages in one of which the concepts are connected, and in the other one they're not, right? So when you translate from one to the other, you're going from one where their connection feels natural to one where their connection is completely not natural. So you need to make up for that. Okay, so that's the kind of the very basic way of explaining Sapir-Whorf. In terms of poetic language, yeah, if you're speaking normally, you don't care that cat is like hat. Doesn't matter, right? You're not thinking about that. The other question about poets learning languages, I have two comments on that. One is that foreign languages are beautiful in the way that's different from the way that your language is beautiful. Because you don't have the meaning quite down. So you have this material thing with semantic possibilities. In a way, the Russian formalists came very close to making the argument. In fact, they kind of made the argument, but they weren't sure that it's a real argument or just a fun argument, that poetry is more like a foreign language, that poetic language works more like a foreign language than like your own language. Because you pay attention to forms of words. You don't immediately jump to meaning. So that's one thing. The other thing is, in purely practical terms, and this is kind of, this is why I actually have a problem with the way, with an aspect of how MFA, how creative writing is taught in this country. I think that to do serious poetry, you need access to another tradition and another language. I also think that I'm wrong because, for example, I don't know, I mean, the Greeks had a pretty good poetry tradition, but the Greeks are famous for not learning foreign languages. The Chinese are also not particularly famous for learning foreign languages. I mean, during the Tang Dynasty. But Li Bai, who was not, possibly not ethnic Chinese or fully ethnic Chinese, quite likely spoke some Turkic language also. You need some kind of an outside position on your own language. It's just that for me, it's just very helpful. And I think for lots of people.
Danielle would like to follow up with another question. Getting back to your being in Germany, Daniel noticed that compared to the book on DJ Spinoza and the one on the pirate, you are shifting to a more narrative form of memoir, which includes wordplay, but seems to be more straightforward. Does it come from your current soundscape, which makes you turn inward and more remote from the jazzy, rap and deconstructed New York City?
Maybe, again, it's hard to say this about yourself. Maybe it's just I'm getting old. It's aging. My hand is shaking. I don't know. Maybe, yeah, probably. I mean, I don't have as much language here. I don't have as much English here as I do in New York. And it's, I feel it's lacked very strongly. And I have almost no vernacular English here. Like in New York, you're always walking around and you're listening to what people are saying and you're like, wow, that's a crazy way of saying, right? I don't do that here at all. I can't get that here. But what I do get here is I get, World War II all the fucking time, sorry. I mean, I live in a neighborhood where almost every building has plaques of people who were deported, where, there's information about race laws on lampposts. It was somebody's art project. And where there's there's just lots of things here that make me think of World War II all the time. And I think that's why I started writing about it. So, you lose English, you get World War II.
It reminds me of the Faulty Towers comedy series, which is a British series where they don't speak about the war, don't speak about the war. So it's a different European experience for sure.
Thank you for the reading, Zhenya, and thank you for hosting this, Zarina. I particularly appreciated the reference to Stein, and I think that made me process the repetitive sequences in these poems of yours in a really different way. It also only just became clear to me that it's Stein and not Stein, which is the German for stone.
Yeah.
But the point that I wanted to bring up, perhaps accidentally, but sort of not to make a moot point of it, not to make it another allusion reference question. This was because of one of the lines in the poems where, I forget what it was exactly, but I think the stone taught itself either to speak or to eat, or to become something else. That of course I started to think about Celan, which is kind of, self-obvious, a multilingual poet that engages with the memory of catastrophe and so on and so forth. But I guess instead of asking you the intertext quote and stuff like that question, I'd rather wanted to suggest that you reflect on the positionality of a Celan-like poet, whether or not you engage with that, whether or not that speaks to you in the current moment, whether or not that position itself is available anymore, or maybe it, you know, is buried back in the 20th century, and you can't be another. You can't pursue a Celanian mode of writing today. I'm curious what you think about that.
I mean, I have some Celan here. In this cycle, and then in the Feeling Sonnets in the previous cycle. You mean the knowing position? What do you mean? The position of the witness? The position of somebody who is processing the stuff inside?
Not really. I mean, that applies as well, that obtains, but more of, I guess I was referring more to the epistemological position that Celan occupies within not just the narratives of trauma and catastrophe of the 20th century, but also within the 20th century tradition of reflecting on language, whether it is dispersed language or violent language, or the displaced kind of language that he, as a, you know, Ukrainian, Romanian Jew writing in German or French, whatever.
Okay, well, okay, so as far as the language part is concerned, I'm not a big Celan expert, but I mean, I think of Celan as like the other Mandelstam, right? So I think of, so like in the sense that, okay, so there's Mandelstam doing all those puns with German and Russian. There's also this kind of weird bit of Khlebnikov in Mandelstam, and you sense it when you read Lifshitz, who was friends with both. When you read the language with which Lifshitz, writing his memoirs in like the late 20s, talking about Zaum, uses this kind of language that is like Mandelstamian, basically. I mean, the who kind of, anyway. And for me, Celan is like the next, kind of a natural next step in that tradition, except it happens in German. If this is what you mean by position, it's a pre-conceptualist position. So it's a tradition where, I mean, where like the word is logos, right? Where you believe in it and it's something that you hold in your mouth, right? I mean, and it's a password. And where poetry matters, right? Because of this. That position, even though this, you know, this translingual experience of Mandelstam with a bit of Khlebnikov thrown in to Celan is extremely important for me, I can't walk around thinking poetry matters because it doesn't, right? I mean, we live in a different universe. And I don't have the sense that language is salvation in the way that they do. That language is like the thing, right? That it's deeply meaningful. I'm not sure that what I'm doing is meaningful. Does that make sense? And that says something about me, but I think might also be historically symptomatic. I mean,
I guess it also depends on how you understand what meaning means for you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
That would be another great question, because we went what poetry means to you, what literature means to you, and now what meaning means to you would be terrific. I don't know if we have time for.
Don't ask it. Don't ask it.
I know. So we have some questions here. Some great question from our YouTube audience, so I'm going to go ahead and ask that. Sonia Franetta, who will also appear on Globus shows during our winter season, is asking, Zhenya, what do you mean by words pushing into other words? That's from the beginning of the program. Do you transliterate the Russian words in your English poems?
Well, okay, so the transliteration question is easy. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. It depends on the local context. And I realize that when I don't transliterate, that I'm alienating, even by using another language, you're alienating some readers. I don't know, sometimes I look on the page in the poem and I'm like, okay, this phrase, I would feel better if this phrase were in Cyrillic. And sometimes I'm fine with this phrase being in italics in transliteration. As far as words pushing into other words, this has to do with continuity and discontinuity. How can I explain this simply? Their meanings affect each other. That's basically what it means. Or their meanings affect each other in two ways. One is the way that I've been talking about, which is that the words are similar. So sometimes when you place similar words next to each other, their meanings begin to start infecting each other. It feels like their meanings are more similar than they actually are. But another way, which I don't use that much because it's more difficult, but I've been thinking about it, is discontinuity. There's a lot of classical poetry that's really based on very, very hardcore discontinuity. Because the continuity, the coherence is provided by the meter, provided by sometimes the rhyme, by formal things. So you can have something like the Japanese renga, which is a game where you respond in your stanza to the imagery in the previous stanza, but not in the stanza before that. But you can also publish the results of that game. It becomes a giant collaborative poem that's a bit like an exquisite corpse. Or in something like a ghazal in Arabic or in Persian, ghazals they're very often like each couplet is like doing its own thing. And they're forced together by the rhythm and the rhyme, but there's not a lot of continuity between them. Like you have to kind of imagine the continuity. In the 20th century, there's poetry that's based on doing this with just words, right? When you bring words together, and they really, they don't make a lot of sense together. So, for example, Vvedensky, the OBERIU, this is what Vvedensky called бессмыслица. And basically, it's something that strict form allows you to do. Because when you put words that don't have that much to do with each other into strict form, they start feeling more natural, more compelling, more like they actually have something to do with each other. So it's a complicated point, but that's what I mean by words colliding. And the term collision is from montage. So it's Eisensteinian montage versus Prokofiev montage. Everybody's nodding.
Recognition, it's good. I think Ezra Pound has a great essay on that in Legacy on Writing too. And we can, again, this is one of this topic. I feel like this could be a series of, we have the literary translation roundtable, and we can have another little roundtable on the discussion on the meanings and go on. And speaking of literary translators, we have a question from another literary translator, Dmitry Manin, who is asking, Zhenya, what's your take on keeping or abandoning rhyme in Russian to English poetry translation?
Rhyme or meter or any particular formal feature, to me, is less important by itself as that the poem has to hang together. Other than the words, it has to hang together in some kind of, has to, like, something about the form has to make it feel compelling. Whether it's rhyme, whether it's done by retaining the rhyme, I have a much greater fondness for off rhymes in English than for regular rhymes. And, you know, in my own practice, as a translator, I don't necessarily keep the rhyme. I keep the sound. Does that make sense? Like, I keep sound clouds. So the same bunch of sounds repeating and permutating, which sometimes it's at the end of words, but it's not always at the end of words. And I don't want lines that feel unnatural, uncompelling because of the rhyme. So I don't really want to twist the lines so that to make the rhyme, because the main thing is compelling, right? The main thing is something has to make the line feel like it's just right. It can be the rhyme, it can be something else. As a Mary can do poet, I mean well. I mean to tell my story. I mean to tell my story well. My story is the story of. My story is the story of how I got to be who I am. A story can be desultory, predatory, or exculpatory. As for me, my story is my history. Such is my repertoire. My history is historical, hysterical, and histrionic. Such is my inventory. My history takes place in language. Or is it my story takes place in language? If my story is my history, then my history takes place in language. Or does it take plunge? My language is your language. Please come in, take the plunge. My history has a depository of body tissue in it. Body tissue is studied under the Greek weaving term histos. As a Mary can do poet, I am a weaver of my history. I am a we. My history is woven of woe. If woe is its weft, then woe is its work. It wafts on pulmonary plumage. It has a fool, a Tor, who minds the store. He talks torrentially but soundly. He suffers an operation and turns into a gate. Either the gate to the transformatory, which is the lavatory, or the gate to the observatory, which is 2 flights down.
Thank you, Zhenya. I see a lot of applause
Thanks.
going on the mute. Thank you for that. That was tremendous. And I don't know, we have resolved the question whether language determines the thought process, which you think it doesn't, but I'm sure that your poetic language has become here in the frame of this program a part of our thought process and hopefully in our collective thinking. And that's what we are trying to do here, incorporate the language, the thought, and the being. And we will be bringing many more shows and programs this fall. In 2 days, on Thursday, we have a reading in English of Mandelstam poetry, which I think is tied up.
Ilya is doing it.
Today, Ilya Bernstein is doing it, so please see if you want to attend that. And then we'll have a few poetry translation seminars and poetry readings on Tsvetaeva's poetry and the whole range of them with Kandinsky poetry, which is quite rare. So check out our schedule, subscribe to the Globus YouTube channel and be a part of it. Thank you so much for doing it and have a great evening, day, morning. And thanks for being here.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thanks so much.